Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Romarowski, the Executive Director of SPME and ASMIA, and it's my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar series. This afternoon, we have really the privilege and opportunity to host Amir Tibon, who will be talking to us about his latest book entitled The Gates of Gaza, a riveting and a horrific read, I think, is a way to correlate, the two together. Amir is a longtime writer for Haaretz. This is his second book that I'm sure he was not planning on writing, given the events of 10/7. But really, I want to stress that, as we've been marking the events of 10/7. There's been so much information, obviously, on what's going on throughout the war. What we have this afternoon is an opportunity to hear a firsthand account from somebody who has the journalistic capabilities to describe what he and his family went through, to try to contextualize the events within the larger constellation of the war in Gaza at large. And so his full bio is really in the invitation that we send around. The book is really something that I recommend everybody should be reading, hopefully getting the book after the webinar. But Amir will talk to us about this whole experience this afternoon. Housekeeping wise, just before we start and I turn it over to Amir, the format will be as follows. Amir will talk for about 30 minutes, then we'll go into Q&A. Please type in your questions via the chat. I know that there'll be a lot of questions. We will do our best to get to all of them. If we don't, feel free to email us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. But really, without further ado, Amir, thank you for taking the time to join us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Asaf, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. Well, I'm going to say this evening because you can see behind me, it's evening time here in Israel. This afternoon for those joining us in the US, and I'm honored to be speaking with you today. I'm joining you today from a place called Mishmar HaEmek. It's a kibbutz in north central Israel, not far from Haifa. And while it's not my home, I've been living here with my family and most of my community ever since October 8th, when Kibbutz Nahal Oz, my home, was evacuated from all its residents in the aftermath of the October 7 attack. And I'll speak in a second about October 7 in Nahal Oz, but I do want to say that here in Mishmar HaEmek, because we are relatively more to the north of Israel, not very north, but apparently north enough, there have been sirens in recent days and even hours indicating rocket launches to this area, or drones being sent across the border from Hezbollah. So if there will be some kind of a siren, I will have to leave my computer for a few minutes and you will have to excuse me. I hope we don't get there, but just saying that if I abruptly step away from the computer, don't be insulted. And like I said, this place where I'm speaking with you now, it's not my home. It's the place that my community, Kibbutz Nahal Oz, has found a temporary home, a refuge in since October 7. On that evening, on the evening of Saturday, October 7, 2023, just over a year ago, Kibbutz Nahal Oz was supposed to celebrate its 70-year anniversary. That evening, we were supposed to have a huge party at the communal pool of the kibbutz. And we were supposed to celebrate 70 years to the foundation of Nahal Oz on October 7, 2023 at 7 p.m. because our kibbutz was founded in October 1953, exactly 70 years before that awful day. The kibbutz was founded in October 1953 by a group of 60 young men and women 19, 20-year-olds who had enlisted in the IDF, went through basic training, and then received a mission from a general who was quite famous at the time, Moshe Dayan, to go and build a new kibbutz directly on the Israeli border with Gaza. Now, to understand the significance and the importance of Nahal Oz, you need to enter the mindset of Israel in the early 1950s. It's a very young country. It was just created after the War of 1948, our War of Independence. It does not have any peace borders, right? It's not the reality we have today where we have peace borders with Jordan and Egypt. Back then, all of Israel's borders are borders with enemy states. And most of the regimes, governments in the Arab world view Israel as a temporary invention, something that came out of the Holocaust, perhaps, and accidentally, was created after 1948, but is definitely not here to stay. And David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, he had a national security strategy that emphasized the importance of communities along the country's new borders, specifically because of that mindset among the Arab leaders that Israel was a temporary entity. He wanted their people and their armies and their intelligence agencies to see with their own eyes new communities being built on the Israeli side of the border in order to send a message that Israel wasn't temporary, that it was actually here to stay. And that's why in the first years of Israel, a lot of new communities, and specifically, by the way, a lot of kibbutzim, were built along the borders of Israel, whether it's the Lebanese border, Jordanian border, and also the border with Gaza. And Kibbutz Nahal Oz was set up as part of that founding strategy, if you will. And it's unique among the different kibbutzim along the Gaza border because of its proximity. Nahal Oz is located 800 meters from the border between Israel and Gaza. It is officially the closest Israeli community to Gaza City. Over the decades, the community grew and expanded, and out of those 60 young founders, we still have a few with us today. They are still young. They just happen to be 90-year-olds now, but as you know, that's all a matter of perception. But the community became home to several hundreds of people, and eventually, on the evening of October 7, it was home to 450 people, which probably doesn't sound like a lot. It's a tiny, small town in American terms. Perhaps even a village would be more appropriate. But for a community located 800 meters from Gaza, that started out with a much lower amount of people, that is actually quite an achievement. And over the decades, there were always security threats and risks associated with life on the border and with such proximity to Gaza. The first member of Kibbutz Nahal Oz, who died after the kibbutz was created, was actually killed by fire from the Egyptian army a month after the kibbutz was created, already in November of 1953. The first mortar was launched toward Kibbutz Nahal Oz in 1955. There was a very famous incident, which I write about in my book, in April 1956, in which one of the founding members of the kibbutz, a young man named Ro'i Rutberg, was killed in an ambush of Egyptian soldiers in the fields outside the kibbutz. And Dayan at the time came to his funeral and gave a very, very important and well-known speech at the funeral, the Nahal Oz speech of Moshe Dayan. I would say really an iconic speech in Zionist history. It's been translated into English. I recommend reading it. It was written 68 years ago, and it's as if it was written yesterday. At the same time, there were also, for many, many years, interesting relationships between this small kibbutz and the huge city located on the other side of the border from it, Gaza City. And in my book, The Gates of Gaza, I write about these relationships and how there were people from Gaza who used to work in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, and people from Nahal Oz would go to do their errands and shopping and just have a good time in Gaza, go to the restaurants on the beach. I write about people from Gaza who attended weddings in our kibbutz, and people from our kibbutz who went to family celebrations on the other side of the border. It's a unique and fascinating history that shows how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is always more complicated than people sometimes would like to see it. And there are layers to it, and there's hostility, and then there's also sometimes cooperation. It's not a binary story. I was not born or raised in Nahal Oz. I don't have a family connection to the place. I actually moved there in the year 2014. 2014 was a very difficult year for communities along the Israel-Gaza border, and specifically for Nahal Oz. There was a war between Israel and Hamas in the summer of that year. We called it at the time Operation Protective Edge. And during that war, Kibbutz Nahal Oz had the distinction of being the most bombarded community in Israel. Hamas fired endless barrages of mortars and rockets of the kibbutz because they realized that while firing rockets at Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which they were already capable of doing in 2014, brings headlines and attention, there is a more than 90% chance that those rockets will be intercepted by Iron Dome. The success rate of Iron Dome in intercepting rockets fired toward Tel Aviv and Jerusalem is more than 90%. Nahal Oz is so close to Gaza, 800 meters, that it is not covered by Iron Dome at all. And so it has no protection. And when there's a rocket fired at Tel Aviv, you have 90 seconds to reach shelter, knowing that Iron Dome will very likely protect you. When there's a mortar fired toward Nahal Oz, you have 7 seconds to reach shelter and no Iron Dome. And so Hamas constantly bombarded the community. And toward the very last days of that war, there was a terrible tragedy in the kibbutz. 4-year-old child named Daniel Tregerman was killed by a mortar from Gaza. And after that happened, the kibbutz was in a very difficult situation, really a crisis. A lot of people left the community. A lot of young families did not want to go back. And that was actually when my wife and I moved over to Nahal Oz from Tel Aviv. I work as a journalist. I write for Haaretz. Miri, my wife, is a social worker. We were living in Tel Aviv when all of that happened. I had visited Nahal Oz during the war to write about it, to interview people there. Something about that place really stuck with me, really entered my heart. And when we heard about this crisis the community was going through, we just made a decision that we're moving there. It was an ideological decision. We believe in the importance of strengthening, protecting the borders of Israel, and of the importance of communities like Nahal Oz that are located along the border and are playing an important role in, again, showing that we are here and we're holding on and we're not going anywhere. And so that war ended in August, August 26, 2014. And on September 26, 2014, my wife and I moved to Nahal Oz. We ended up staying there, getting married there, finding our home there, our community, a sense of belonging, a lot of friends. And I can say that for our 2 daughters, we have a 4.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, life in Nahal Oz wasn't a mission or a choice or an ideological decision like it was for us. It was simply their home. The kibbutz they were born in, a beautiful green kibbutz full of trees and flowers and gardens and lawns, surrounded by vast open fields, and really a wonderful place. And like I said, on October 7, we were preparing for a big celebration to celebrate 70 years to this magical place, to this amazing community. And instead, it ended up being the worst day in the history of our community, and also the worst day in the history of the State of Israel. We woke up that morning at 6:30 from a very heavy barrage of mortars fired toward our neighborhood. We live in a neighborhood on the more eastern side of the kibbutz. It was a constant bombardment. And what we immediately did, we ran to our safe room, or if you have relatives in Israel, you would know the term mamad. The safe room is a room built of thick concrete that is supposed to withstand even direct hits by mortars or rockets. And along the Israel-Gaza border, there is a room like that in every house because those are communities that are targeted. And most families, like our family, that's where the children go to sleep at night. Because then, if there's a rocket or a mortar barrage fired toward the community in the middle of the night or at 6:30 in the morning, the parents have to run to the children and not the other way around. And when you have 7 seconds to run, that makes a big difference. So we were in bed, 6:30 in the morning. We hear the whistling of the mortar. That's actually how I opened the book, with that whistle sound. And we just ran directly to the safe room where our two daughters were sleeping peacefully. They did not wake up from the explosions or the sirens. Growing up in Nahal Oz, they were used to it, to be honest. Over the years, we had many, many incidents of rockets and mortars fired toward the kibbutz and a lot of alarms going off. And they knew and were used to it, so they continued to sleep. We closed this heavy door of the safe room. We covered the window with a metal plate that's attached to the wall. And we were completely calm. Okay, Hamas is firing rockets and mortars at our community. This has happened to us many times over the years that we were living there. And we knew that it means another round of fighting between Israel and Hamas has begun. And these rounds of fighting usually have their own logic and their own kind of sequence that always repeats itself. They fire at us, we fire at them. Sometimes it's the other way around. We kill some terrorists and then they fire at us and then we respond. But, there's this exchange of blows. We usually would leave the kibbutz when that happened. One of the lessons learned from 2014, no need to keep children in the community at times of heightened tension. So we would leave the community, be out of home for maybe a week, maybe two. And toward the end, there would be a ceasefire, and the prime minister would go on television and say that we hit them really hard, and now they're afraid of us. And we would go back home, and half a year later, the whole thing would repeat itself. And we actually had just that entire sequence I described to you happen in May 2023. There was an operation that lasted 5 days. Israel bombarded Gaza. Hamas did not participate back then. It was Islamic Jihad bombarded our communities. After a few days, we got that message that we really showed them this time. We went back home. So 5 months later, we find ourselves in the safe room under fire, and we say, "Oh, it makes sense," like always. But this time it was different, and it took us not too long to understand it was different because around I would say 6:45 a.m. the electricity went down, which was unusual, something that did not happen in previous rounds of fighting. No electricity in our entire community. At 7 a.m., we began to hear automatic gunfire, which was even more unusual. And at 7:15 a.m., our house was surrounded by 5 Hamas terrorists, armed with Kalashnikovs, RPGs, hand grenades. We were in the room, quiet, dark, no electricity, no food, 2 young girls. Our house was locked. All the blinds were rolled all the way down, all the windows were shut. And the terrorists were trying to break in, and we were trying to stay quiet so they don't hear us and don't come to search for us. And they were firing live ammunition in our living room. That was the situation at 7:15 a.m. On that day, Kibbutz Nahal Oz was invaded by more than 100 Hamas terrorists. Now here I want to say something that's important to understand for context. Kibbutz Nahal Oz, like I told you, had existed on the border with Gaza for 70 years. And there were always people on the other side of the border who wanted to kill the residents of Nahal Oz. The first member of this kibbutz who was killed, like I told you, it was November 1953. The first mortar was fired in 1954. There was an incident in 1969 when 2 members of the kibbutz were killed after a landmine was placed by terrorists in the fields of the kibbutz. I mentioned in my book a famous Israeli song from 1974 that describes the phenomenon of hand grenades being thrown at cars on the roads near the border with Gaza. There was the first Intifada in 87 and the second Intifada in 2000. The first Qassam rocket was launched from Gaza at Nahal Oz in the year 2001. So there were always people on the other side who wanted to kill the residents of Nahal Oz and looked for creative ways to do so. But throughout that 70-year history, one thing never, ever happened. A terrorist had never stepped foot inside the kibbutz. Even, by the way, not in the 1950s and 60s and 70s when there was not even a border fence between Israel and Gaza. The border was basically a ditch in the ground separating our fields from theirs. And I write about that in the book as well. So to have a community that for 70 years exists on this tense border, and there is an enemy on the other side that wants to hurt it. But for 70 years, not to have a single terrorist succeed in entering that community. And then on one morning, have that community invaded by more than 100, that tells you something about the significance and the magnitude of the failures of October 7. So the kibbutz is washed by terrorists, more than 100 of them. And they are met by a fighting force of 14 men, 14 heroes who it's a combination of our local security team made up of residents who are trained and armed for emergency situations, and a very small force of the Israeli border patrol that was stationed in our kibbutz a few weeks before and had a mission that, some kind of a routine mission along the border, and was actually supposed to leave the kibbutz on Sunday morning, on Sunday, October 8th. This combined force, local security team and small border patrol team, together it's 14 men. And they are facing more than 100 terrorists. They went out and fought them. And in the 5th chapter of my book, I tell their story, the story of the battle they waged against the terrorists, which is truly a heroic and unbelievable battle. But it was a very, very costly one as well, because by 9 a.m., out of the 14, only 8 were left. 2 were killed. One of them, my next door neighbor, Ilan Fiorentino. Just today, we held a memorial service for him here in Mishmar HaEmek. So 2 of the 14 were killed. Another 4 were injured to a level where they could no longer fight. And so out of the 14, 8 were left. And those 8 continued fighting for many, many more hours. And I write in the book about their story and the battle that they waged. While we were barricading in our safe room with the 2 young girls who woke up from the gunfire in the living room and asked us what's going on, can we go outside? And we had to keep them quiet and calm, which was a big challenge. And I'll just say something about that. One of the things we learned on that day, we learned that if you want to have the children listen to you, your words don't matter, only your actions. Because telling the girls, oh, we have to be quiet, but that wouldn't cut it. We had to keep them calm by actually showing that we were calm as well. And we had to keep them quiet by ourselves also being quiet and not losing it and not showing any signs of, being too worried or too concerned, because otherwise they would feel the fear and they would act it out. And so we had to remain very calm, very reserved in order to convince our 2 young girls, again, one of them 2 years old, the other 3.5, that they also had to stay quiet. And we succeeded. It was quite a challenge, but we succeeded. And, sometimes I ask myself how exactly. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but many children in our community were unbelievable heroes on that day. The children had to contend with this impossible situation for many, many hours. No electricity, no light, no entertainment, no food in many of these safe rooms. And there were many, many, many heroes on that day. And again, I write about many of them in the book, but I really think the young children, they are in a category of themselves when it comes to heroism. While the kibbutz was attacked, there was also an invasion by Hamas into a military base next to Nahal Oz, which was run by more than 200 terrorists who came into it and basically conquered that kibbutz, that military base. It's called the Nahal Oz base, and it has the sad distinction of being the one place where we lost the highest number of soldiers on October 7. 52 soldiers were killed in that base on October 7. This includes fighters of the Golani Brigade, tank fighters, and also many female soldiers who were intelligence soldiers. They were what we call spotters. They had a very important role of examining cameras overlooking the border area. And actually, in the weeks before the October 7 attack, these female soldiers, again and again, tried to warn their commanders that they were seeing very unusual activities along the border, and their warnings were dismissed and ignored. And many of them ended up dying in that attack. While we were barricading with our girls in the safe room around 7:15 a.m., I called my parents who live in Tel Aviv. My father is a retired general in the Israeli military. My mom is a former high school principal and today a Holocaust historian. They got into their car and just decided to drive from Tel Aviv to our kibbutz after hearing from us the situation that we were surrounded by the terrorists. And I write in the book at length about their story, the journey they made toward Nahal Oz, the people they saved along the way, total strangers that were in harm's way and were in need of rescue, and eventually how we also met up later in the day. I won't go into all the details because I do want people to read the story in the book, but I do want to say something in general that connects all the dots of what I spoke about. That small team of 14 heroes who stood up against the terrorists, and then the 8 out of those 14 who continued to fight for very long hours, and the soldiers in the military base next to us who were fighting an impossible battle after more than 200 terrorists invaded their base. And also the story of my parents, a couple 62 years old who found themselves rescuing injured soldiers and saving people who had run away from the Nova party and were almost murdered by the terrorists. What connects all these dots is that these are stories of incredible courage and heroism, but they are also stories of immense failure. And in a way, the two things are connected to one another because all that courage, all that heroism was required because of the magnitude of the failure, because the systems didn't work, the government didn't function, the military responded too slowly, the intelligence was wrong, everything didn't work. And usually, the biggest stories of bravery and courage happen when there are systemic failures, when there is something deeply wrong, something doesn't work. That's when you need people to step up. And in a way, that is the biggest story of October 7 from the Israeli perspective. A day when everything didn't work, when everything fell apart, and at the same time, a day when a lot of people stepped up and did everything they could to try to save others. On that day in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, 15 people, friends and neighbors of ours, were murdered. 15. Out of a community of 450 people, that is basically 3.5% of the population. And you try to think about it. Try to think about a neighborhood, a small town, a village somewhere that on one day loses 3.5% of the population. Just think about, try to imagine it in your town, in your neighborhood, what that would look like. We also had 7 people kidnapped into Gaza on that day. The youngest was an 8-year-old girl, and the oldest an 84-year-old woman. In November, 5 of our 7 hostages were returned to Israel alive, thanks to the deal orchestrated by President Biden. And that deal brought us back 100 women and children alive out of the more than 200 who were kidnapped. And I can tell you that at the end of November, when those 5 women and girls from our kibbutz came back alive, that was the only day since October 7th that I was happy. The only day. We still have 2 friends of ours in the hands of Hamas, Omri Miran and Tzachi Dan. Both of them are fathers of young children. They're both in their 40s. Tzachi was kidnapped into Gaza after his 18-year-old daughter was murdered in front of his eyes. We received a signal of life from him, a video put out by Hamas 10 months ago. Omri was kidnapped in front of the eyes of his 2 young girls who were in kindergarten with my girls, very young. We received a video showing him alive half a year ago. And we've been fighting ever since to secure their release and their return to us alive. It's been a very, very difficult time, big challenge, and we are focused on bringing them back alive, and at the same time we are also working on repairing the damages that happened in the kibbutz on that day. It's painfully slow, but we're working on it to get the place back to being the paradise that it was for many, many years, and that it will be again in the future. And I wrote the book, The Gates of Gaza. Basically, I started working on it at the end of November, right after that hostage deal. I finished writing it in late May. I wrote it in English because my intention, my mission was to tell the story to the world. So I wrote the story in English. I published it in the US with Little Brown and Company. Later, I translated myself into Hebrew to also get it to the audience here in Israel. And it's also been translated since into German and French. And now other languages are in the works. And I believe that telling the story is one of the most important things we need to do right now. There's a lot of people out there denying, minimizing, justifying what happened on October 7th. And our best way to contend with that despicable phenomenon is to keep telling and spreading the story. I'm not a big believer in the concept of haspara. I mean, haspara in Hebrew means explaining, and in my field of work, I write a lot about international politics. If you're explaining, you're already losing. But if you're telling a story, and we have quite a story to tell, we Israelis, we residents of the border area, we people who were there on October 7th, if you're telling a strong story, I know people will listen. That's what I try to do. I'll stop here, let everyone take a second to, breathe and think about all the information I shared with you. And then would love to take some questions from the audience. And thank you for being here and listening. And again, I'm honored to be sharing this with you.
Great. 1 second. Thank you so much. Amir, can you hear me? Oh, so thank you so much again. So thank you for telling the story. And as I said before for our audiences, I mean, the story is riveting, it's powerful, and it's critical that telling the story. All our members, or many of our members here, are involved in the academy. We know about the denial. We know about what's been happening on a great deal of American college campuses. So there is no doubt that the story needs to be heard, and the kind of firsthand account that you have to share. I was, as I said, before the webinar began, deeply moved by your personal story. It was really an amazing story to hear, and to hear you live talk about it is something else. And I highly recommend everybody to read the book. I don't want to have a spoiler when it comes to the book itself, and obviously we want people to read it. But I do have a question to start us off, and then I'll pass it on to Alex, and then we'll go on to the audience. You're a an optimistic guy, and clearly you've been through a lot, and the trauma and everything that that you've gone through. Can you share? I mean, just to go into obviously the system, your last point about the failure of the systems.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it today? I mean, it wasn't clear. I mean, and I guess I'm asking also about you and other members of the kibbutz who have now obviously relocated to other places that are equally as unsafe, given where you are now and rockets and whatnot.
It's all over the country now, basically.
Right. Is your plan, are you still planning on moving back to Nahal Oz?
Yeah.
What's the future
Yes.
look like? What's the next
Yeah.
generation look like for you? And obviously the elders. I mean, you spoke about the young 99-year-olds. After living through this trauma, if we could talk about a little bit about that.
Yes. Today, there are 20 people living in the kibbutz. 20 people have returned out of a community of 450. Well, obviously, that's a small amount, but it's not nothing. Half a year ago, we didn't even have that. I think most of the people who, at least those who have children, once a decision was taken, and it was taken several months ago, to start the school year still in the evacuation point, far from home in the temporary house, you can call it like that. That basically meant the next exit ramp is the end of the school year and the beginning of the next one, because once you have kids of a certain age, all other calendarial years of measuring times are just irrelevant. There's no Hebrew year, there's no, Gregorian year, there's no Zoroastrian year, there is school year. Okay, the kids enter a school or a kindergarten at a certain place. Unless you really have to, you don't move them, especially when you have kids who have just been through the kind of trauma our children communally have gone through. So once a decision was made to start the school year over here in Mishmar HaEmek, the next exit ramp to decide, okay, now is the time to schlep back to Nahal Oz will be the end of the school year so that the children can start the next school year at home in Nahal Oz. And I'm pretty optimistic about that. I think that is a realistic timeline, enough time to rebuild, to fix the damages, to start planning new projects, build that better, if you will. And hopefully by then we will also be, in a different place in the security aspect. The war will be over. I mean, today when I go to Nahal Oz, and I go there quite a lot. I was there twice last week. I try to go almost every week. The war is still felt there very, very strongly. Okay, from time to time there will be the mortar or rocket launch, but even without that, you just hear fighting on the other side of the border very, very intensely. Gunfire, explosions, planes in the sky. Not a very nice environment to raise children. So I think, if we look toward that as kind of like I don't want to say a deadline, but as our goal to start the next school year over there, that's a realistic goal. And I think we can do it. Now, every family will have to make its own decisions, about going back or not. And those decisions will be impacted by personal trauma, will be impacted by the sense of security, will be impacted by the conditions and circumstances of life. After 2 years out of home, some people will have found new jobs in other parts of Israel. Some children will have made good friends in, where we are evacuated to and maybe don't want to. I mean, this is going to be a difficult decision for every family. I do have hope that most families will return, that most people at the end of the day will decide that the right thing to do is to go back home. But I want to point out two things that are very, very important to us as a community, and that will have a big impact on this entire discussion of coming home. Number one, we need to see the state of Israel actually learn the lessons of October 7th. Learn and improve. And the best way to do that is through a mechanism that we have here in the state of Israel and have been using for decades called Va'adat Chakira Mamlachtit, a national commission of inquiry. This is it's not some kind of like a loose thing. It's a very well-defined mechanism in Israeli law of how you set up a commission to inquire massive systemic failures of the state. We had a commission like that set up after the Yom Kippur War, which was on the one hand a war that started with a terrible surprise and brought Israel to the brink of disaster. And on the other end was a relatively short war, ended after 3 weeks with the armies of Israel almost in Damascus and almost in Cairo. If that war had a national commission of inquiry in order to learn from the failures and not have them repeated, it is obvious that this war, which began with the one day when the largest amount of Israelis were killed in a span of 24 hours, and has been going on for more than a year now, must be investigated to the same level. So far, such a commission has not been set up by the government. And that would, I think, give a lot of confidence to people if we had such a commission begin its work, so that we would know that all the failures of the military, of the intelligence, the government, everybody will be investigated, and this, conclusions and lessons will be drawn. So that's one thing. The second thing is the issue of the hostages. And here I'll say something very personal about myself. For me, moving back to Nahal Oz, those of you who will read the book will understand, it means moving back to a house where a neighbor was killed in the house in front of me. Another neighbor was murdered in the house behind me. A brave police fighter was one of that small team, was killed on my doorstep. So it's a house surrounded by death. And that's the house that I will come back to raise my daughters. And I'm telling you, I can do it. I really believe I can do it. And I can give them a happy childhood in that house, despite everything. But I don't know if I can pass every day by the homes of my friends, Omri and Tzachi, and know that we left them to die in the tunnels of Gaza, that we did not bring them back. I don't know if I can do that. That is, on the emotional level, very difficult. When I go to visit the kibbutz today and I go to my house, I'm very sad about everything that happened, but I also feel good to be in my house. I feel good to be in my home. And I feel that we can find a way to commemorate the neighbors and friends that we lost on that day and to build the place better in their name. But when I pass by the homes of Omri and Tzachi, I don't want to be there. I feel terrible that they are still in Gaza and I'm passing by their house. And we really have to solve that issue. It will make a huge difference for bringing back the community and all the other communities impacted by this situation.
Great, thank you for that. Before we go to the audience, I know Alex has a question. Let's see.
Sure. Thanks very much for an important presentation. I think my question has to do with the book itself, and specifically the reception of the book. It's a very different environment, very difficult environment intellectually, let's call it, in the United States and in Europe since October 7th. All the kinds of things that we all know and talk about all the time have burgeoned to unimaginable levels. And a book like yours, which discusses in detail a particular aspect,
Yep.
How has it been received, favorably or unfavorably, or both?
I think, first of all, this is such an important question, and I want to say I really appreciate what a lot of the participants on this call have been dealing with over the past year. and the hardships that you have been facing in the academic environment in the US. I know this is a very, very important issue. Regarding the book, I think the last option you gave, Alex, both is kind of the right answer. I've had events in the US and in France and in Germany to promote the book. I've had thousands of people show up, thousands show up to hear the story. The book has sold many thousands of copies. And so you can say that's a good reception. It's received a lot of praise in the media, in the US, in Germany, in France. There were also other responses. There was one specifically negative review in one of the leading French newspapers that really went hard after the book and after me for supposedly ignoring the Palestinians and minimizing their suffering and ignoring their story, which I thought was very unfair, because anybody who will read the book, I think, will actually see that while it is clearly written from an Israeli perspective by an Israeli journalist with a Zionist worldview, it also presents the complexities and the different narratives around the conflict, specifically in the chapters of the book that deal with the history of Nahal Oz. So I thought that was a very unfair review. But even in that review, the French journalist who wrote it had to admit that it is written like a thriller. You can't put it out of your hands. It's a page turner. And he even wrote that it reads like a Hollywood production. So I told my publisher in France, who was very unhappy about the review, really because it was unfair, I told him, let that be the kind of negative review we get everywhere, okay? With all those good parts. I haven't been invited yet to speak about it in college campuses because it came out late September and, school was off. I believe that could be a challenging environment to discuss it, but I'm not shying away from that. I can tell you that in the first months of the war after October 7, I did not fly to the US. I stayed in Israel, but I did a lot of Zoom briefings like this one to university students. I had one organized in Stanford, and I had one in Colombia. And, I understand the importance of this, and I dealt with very difficult questions on those briefings. I know it's not an easy environment, and that should not change the determination to keep telling the story. If anything, it should do the opposite. Because of the hostility, because of the unfair way that a lot of this is being presented, it's ever more important to keep talking about it.
Great, thank you. Alex, I'm going to go to the audience.
Please.
We'll go back. So there are a bunch of questions, Amir, and I'm going to try to kind of bring some of the themes that are common together. But I guess one thing that is coming up here, apropos your last point to Alex about the difficulty about sharing the story and how it's received in the States. One common question here is, what can we do to help out, to share this story? I mean, beyond some of these accounts, obviously, we can talk about this later. We're more than happy to help out with more campus events, collaborations for you to tell the story. But as far as the level of denial that you're seeing here, the denialism that, as far as 10/7 is become one of the more nefarious and insidious actions, in particular on American college campuses, and telling the story. Even here we are marking, a year since 10/7 began. So what is helpful from your vantage point as somebody who straddles, the periphery, the center, here in the States, here, in Israel, you've done that through your own life. But what have you found to be more effective, as far as trying to convey the stories? I mean, beyond your story, we've seen here exhibits,
so many stories,
the Nova Festival and other kind of things that are happening. But is there something that you, in particular, been observing that has been effective?
I think there is no substitute to a personal story. I mean, you can tell the bigger story, the numbers, the horrors, the kind of like the themes, and all of that is important. But a personal story, a lot of times, will really hit home with people, and allow the person listening to ask themselves for a second, what would I do? what would I do in that situation if I had two young kids in a room surrounded by terrorists and I had to keep them quiet? And I think that's really important to let the personal stories of people be told and break through. I also think it's very, very important to stick to the facts and never, ever, ever exaggerate anything. And this is a phenomenon that I've been worried about, that sometimes people will say things that are uncorroborated, like, 40 babies were beheaded in Kibbutz Kfar Aza. This was something that pro-Israeli influencers were sharing on social media in the beginning of the war. Completely untrue. I mean, you did not have 40 babies killed in the entire border region on October 7th. I mean, there were babies who were killed. It's in the single digits. We should be talking about each one of them and telling her story. We should be talking about the Bibas brothers, the two young children, one of them literally a baby kidnapped with his mother from his home in Kibbutz near Oz, 25 minutes from my kibbutz. We should never, ever, ever fall into these traps of exaggeration or making stuff up, especially because it is so unnecessary. The stories themselves that truly happened are so horrific and show the monstrosity of Hamas so clearly that it's terrible when people try to, on top of it, add other things that did not happen. And we should really be careful about that because it helped the other side discredit the stories that did happen. And that's something that for me in writing the book was a high priority. The book, while it's, parts of it are more like a memoir, other parts are more historical research. I'll show the notes. I mean, everything is written with, an index and historical notes because I knew that it would be under the magnifying glass of people who will try to discredit the details. And we have to remember that, there is a big effort to do that. And we have to be aware and on top of it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go out to another question here. Eric Tucker is asking, I mean, and again, this is about your own platform regarding Haaretz. I mean, how do you personally feel about, the platform that your paper gives and what he's describing as to people are extremely critical, how, when it comes to the war itself, and if you want to comment on some, on the platform of Haaretz and in general.
Yeah, I'm very proud to be part of Haaretz. I think it's the best newspaper in Israel. I don't agree with every article that is published in the opinion pages, or with every analysis article that some of my colleagues write. Disagreement within newspapers is very important. Haaretz is not one of those newspapers where you cannot express a dissenting view or have arguments, and I think that's healthy. Sometimes I read stories about things in the American media where like there's an event at a newspaper and all the journalists are like, up in arms with the same view. Haaretz is different about that, and it has different voices and different points of view. And I can tell you that the newspaper was incredibly supportive of my decision to write the book and my commitment to tell this story. If you want to argue about the specific op-ed or headline, there's a good chance I already complained about it to my colleagues and editors, but you're happy to raise it. But in the bigger picture, I think Haaretz has a vital role in Israel. It's a newspaper that doesn't matter who's in power and who's trying to get to power. Everybody knows it. They will be scrutinized and covered in this newspaper without fear or favor. And it's really important, especially these days.
Great, thank you for that. There's one question that's come up. I mean, if it's too personal, that's okay to avoid this. And let me add to some of that as well. I mean, some of the questions about, your kids. I mean, the level of PTSD that, kids in Israel are suffering through. Your daughters, as you mentioned, were born in Nahal Oz. My earlier question I said about you going home, your kid, obviously your kids want to, I mean, is that what they're seeing, that they want to go home, or they prefer to live with Saba and Safta, or where you are now, given the trauma that they've gone through.
Yeah. So I can tell you, I can only talk about my girls. This is very personal. I can't talk about other people's children, but I think for my girls, several things really have helped them deal with this entire situation. One thing is, the specific circumstances of our story, that eventually their grandfather was able to arrive to Nahal Oz and get to our house, and tell that story as well in the book. And I think that kind of changed the trajectory of the day. They still spent, let's say, 10 hours in that situation, in the safe room alone with us in the dark, surrounded by the bad people, but there was some kind of a happier ending. And it's also the fact that we as parents really, really try to exhibit calm and not to get, a sense of tension into their understanding of that day. But at the same time, we don't lie to them about it. We don't hide anything. We actually wrote, my wife and I together, like a children's story for them about that day. Like we wrote and printed, not book printed, but like, papers that we clipped together that tell the story of what happened on that day, how we woke up from the noises and how there were dangerous people outside and we had to be quiet and there was no food and they couldn't go to the bathroom. And eventually their grandfather arrived and we were late at night evacuated from the kibbutz on a bus, and we moved to this different kibbutz, but still with all of our friends, because we wanted to make sense to them about it. And I think that also helped. We have not taken them back to Nahal Oz yet. I've been many, many times. My wife has been several times. We haven't taken the girls yet. We want to take them there when the war is over and the kibbutz is rebuilt. We don't want to take them there and relive anything that's scary. Scary noises, scary situation, bullet marks in the windows and the walls. We want to bring them back when it's like October 6th. Or even better, usually. But that at least should be the minimum point. The house is completely clean. There are no scars and marks from that day, and the border is quiet, secure. We understand that we will never have 100% security. That just doesn't exist in the state of Israel. Israel is surrounded by hostile forces and enemies. There will always be people who will want to kill us. Even when you have peace agreements like we have with Jordan and Egypt, that does not guarantee 100% security. I think the peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt are amazing strategic assets for the state of Israel. But we had a year and a half ago an incident where a Jordanian soldier killed 3 Israeli soldiers. And we had 3 weeks ago an incident where a Jordanian terrorist murdered 3 Israelis in the border crossing point. So there is never 100% security. But we don't want to bring them into a war zone. And we are waiting for the day that we can actually do it.
Amen to that. And thank you for
Yes. Yes.
I'm going to give Alex the last question. I know our time is coming to an end, unfortunately, and I appreciate you taking the time, but I'm going to let Alex ask the last question, and then I apologize to the audience not getting to all the questions, but if you do email us, as I mentioned after the webinar, we will make sure that Amir gets the questions, and we will circle.
Please do. Please do.
Alex, you get the last one.
Sure. The process of restoring trust between the Israeli people and the government, meaning the security system, the political system, is going to be lengthy and painful. And we can argue whether it should have started a year ago or when and under what circumstances. Certainly a national commission of inquiry is the standard that has always been used. But I'm wondering what it will take for trust, let's call it, to be reestablished between Israelis and Palestinians.
Oh,
And
wow.
It's not an answerable question, so I apologize.
I honestly think that first of all, a lot of time. A lot of time. We are nowhere near a situation where we are, able to discuss that. And, people who will read the book will see also those chapters in history where you had relationships between Israelis and Palestinians
Right.
along the Gaza border and cooperations and friendships. I think today we have been set back very, very much from that reality. I don't know if it's a matter of years or decades, but it's somewhere in that range. And of course, no Hamas. No Hamas. There cannot be any cooperation, any agreements, any deal making with Hamas. That is something that should never be tried again. If there's a different leadership in Gaza, we should give the opportunity to work with it. We should be very cautious, but we should at least give it a chance. With Hamas, it's never going to work. They are fanatic ideologues, truly committed to their stated goals of destroying Israel. If there's a different leadership, and I think it will also require a different political leadership in Israel, but let's say, we get to that point where we have different leaderships on both sides, maybe we can start that process, but even then it will be a very lengthy, cautious, and difficult process that will probably take years. Because right now there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of pain, there's desire for revenge, there's a lot of bad emotions that have come up from October 7, from the war, and only time, I think, will be able to open other opportunities.
Great. Amir, thank you really for taking the time. Thank you.
My pleasure. If it's okay, I sent Asaf, I sent you a link to the Amazon page of the book. If you can share it with the entire audience, because I don't have access for people who would like to purchase it on Amazon.
I will gladly share that around. I mean, and I think that everybody should read the book. It is a riveting and a powerful story that should be shared by all, and we'll also pass it along also in the post webinar email that will go out as well. So thank you so much for telling the story. Thank you for all you're doing, and really it's riveting, and it's something that everybody, to my mind, should hear these personal stories, because if you want to talk about understanding what took place on 10/7, this is where it starts.
My pleasure and honor, and thank you so much for having me. And I, from Israel, wishing you a good rest of your day.
Thank you as always, and thank you, Alex, for joining me. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon, and we will talk soon. So have a good day. Thanks, Amir.